amounts of industry, and also he's the guy that decides to pay his workers $5 an hour. But he also creates what he calls his sociological department, in which he creates very, very rigid rules for his employees of which they have to live by, including a dress code for the women who lived in his factory towns, which required them to wear dresses that went all the way down to their ankles, and also had curfews for both men and women were not allowed to travel throughout the town without a male escort. So, you know, good and bad Henry Ford, okay? Between 1860 and 1900, though, there is a huge more, like a ton more areas and access to places to go and buy products. We see this kind of development of a lot of places that we take for granted as far as where you can buy your products, but before this time you went to a general store where you bought products and you could get different things, but the access to certain products was relatively limited. You didn't have as wide a variety of different products. Well, Sears comes along and he actually starts out by buying some watches off of a guy and then goes on, yes, as in Sears and like Sears and Roebuck as in the store, okay? So he actually goes and he buys a bunch of watches off of a guy and then goes on a train and starts going from place to place to place to sell these watches, and doing so he's actually able to sell the watches at a much greater profit. And because of that, he figures out that, hey, if I actually buy large amounts of something in a large quantity, I can buy it very cheaply, much like I did my watches, and then I can turn it around and sell it for a large profit. Thus, he develops basically the first chain stores and also the first like big box kind of retail stores. So he's the first like guy that comes up with these ideas of how to market to a much broader audience. The Sears catalog then will go on to be sent out throughout the mail and allow people to access products that otherwise they wouldn't have been able to access. In addition, Penny, JC, I think it's like, it's either James or John, I don't remember for sure, but anyways, Penny, he will actually go out and develop a store much along the same lines as Sears and include that catalog kind of thing as well. So we see many of these kind of catalog stores develop as a result of that. But still yet there's still this idea that the reason why all of these guys are doing so well is because they have this industrious nature to them, that they have already, that evolutionarily they are more advanced than the poor, and the poor simply lack the enterprise to be able to figure out how to do this. Sears doesn't start out as a wealthy man. He becomes wealthy through the use of selling these watches, and he argues that anybody could do this. This is not just an argument that's supported by business, it's also this social Darwinist argument is also supported by religion as well. In particular, a guy by the name of Reverend Russell Conwell, he writes this book called Acres of Diamonds, and in his book he says that not a poor person in us, or in us, who has not made poor by his own shortcomings. So in other words, if you're poor, it's because you suck and it's your own fault. And they're like, so if you don't want to be poor, then figure it out and do something else. Most of that, all of that, and these guys often justify that uneven wealth and uneven distribution of wealth. But like I said, there are a few exceptions to that. We already kind of talked about this, so I'm just going to briefly touch on it. But he argued that he learned what poverty meant as his as a child, and watching his workers get killed at the Pullman strike, he says that it burnt up into my heart that my father had to beg for work. I could cure that. But he still argued that the disparities in the race were actually good for people, and that people without this kind of push to create wealth would just live in universal squalor. Okay. Now Carnegie, as though he will donate a large portion of his money, remember we talked about that he donated about $350 million or whatever of his wealth, and John D. Rockefeller will actually donate more of his wealth than Carnegie does, and so will actually give away about like $580 million to philanthropy, where Carnegie's only about $350 million. But you have to realize that Rockefeller was worth more money too, so therefore he could also give away a lot more of his wealth. We talked about this guy briefly, but just so that you get his name down, in order to make work more efficient, Frederick Winslow Taylor argues that what we need to do is we need to start applying science above and beyond applying science to humans, like with social Darwinism. We also need to take those same kind of ideas of science and efficiency and apply them to business. And he argued that if you trained an individual person to do one specific task, they would become very, very good at doing that one specific task, because they wouldn't have to worry about anything else. And in addition to that, it would become very easy, very cheap, and very efficient for you to train them to do that one very simple task. So if we were building a car, maybe I take and I ask Dylan puts the lug nuts on the wheel that holds it on, right? Okay. Are you serious?
No.
Like, I don't know if you're being serious with me or you're being like sarcastic. Okay, so he puts the lug nuts on. He doesn't tighten them, he just puts them on. Does that make sense? Okay, and then it moves forward along the assembly line, and then Zach actually tightens down the lug nuts on the tire itself. Okay, does that make sense? And then it moves along the assembly line, and maybe Esme hangs the bracket that is needed for the bumper, but she doesn't actually put the screw or tighten down the screws. It goes on to Journey, and Journey tightens the screws. Does that make sense? And because each person is doing something that is so small, it allows you to create something maybe in a much more rapid pace. That reorganization of work as applied to the assembly line will largely revolutionize how things are manufactured, including how cars are manufactured. In particular, the car will go from costing a person, basically we could usually, or before the assembly line, we could produce a car in about a week, and we were able to go from that to being able to produce 5 to 10 cars per day. And then it only increases from there. Does that make sense? So it allows us to rapidly produce these things, and as we can produce more, it will always drive the cost down. But as these individuals gained more and more wealth, they also became greedier with that wealth and tried to consolidate their wealth in any way that they possibly could. So we call these Gilded Age business tactics, but basically the time frame, we have these companies will create, and they begin starting to sell their stock of their companies on the open market. So by the 1880s, the Supreme Court basically argued that companies have the same exact rights as an individual does, and they basically allowed the companies to do whatever they wanted. Which then also meant that these companies would create pools and they would fix prices. A pool would basically mean like what we used for the example with gas, right? That everybody in town would say, okay, gas is going to cost $2.24 a gallon. If we all charge $2.24 a gallon, we can basically keep incrementally raising the price as much as we want and get whatever we want for it. Does that make sense? A commodity like gasoline today, our society cannot go without. Does that make sense? So gas prices in the United States would have to raise astronomically before you would see the American market stop buying gas. Does that make sense? Especially in a location like Fargo, because there's not a lot of access to mass transit. And most people live a distance from where they work or where they go to school.
And it's really cold.
And it's really cold most of the time of the year. Does that make sense? So it would be different if we lived in like New York City, where there is access to large amounts of mass transit, but there isn't that in Fargo. So arguably, if we fixed prices of gas in Fargo, you could probably go up and start charging up to $5 a gallon of gas before Fargoians would start like really pushing back against that. Does that make sense? Which would be astronomical. But in the depths of the recession, of the 2008 recession, we did see gas prices in California go up to almost $4 a gallon. So, if you can imagine that. I remember being in high school and paying like $1.50 a gallon, and I thought that was expensive. What I wouldn't give to go back to $1.50. Oh well. The other thing that they do is they create trusts, and basically what this does is you're creating a conglomerate of a company through whether it's horizontal or vertical integration. So say for example that I own a car manufacturer, and I want to buy other car manufacturers, and even if I don't actually buy out those other companies and create a larger company of those, I could go to Dylan and we could basically create a partnership together, so that way we could ensure certain prices are being charged for our product. Does that make sense? But these large trusts and these very large commodities basically allow us to create monopolies over a product. In today's market, there's only one type of legal monopoly in the United States. Does anybody know what it is? Well, actually, kind of. There's only one type of full, complete legal monopoly in the United States. Anybody know what it is? What? No, it's not oil. It's if you own a patent on a product. Does that make sense? Then you have a complete monopoly over over that particular product. However, there are some simple monopolies within communities. So like, for example, some communities only have access to one cable network provider. That creates a monopoly. Or one person or one company that is providing internet. That is a monopoly. Does that make sense? And those are legal under the federal government because of the wiring that needs to be put into the ground, so they give that back to them. You can see this same kind of thing with like maybe one energy provider, like Xcel Energy, right? Okay, providing you with your power for your house. Okay, but all of these allows to create these very, very large companies. And when you create such large companies, it allows them to then basically take control over all of industry. So as a result, we wind up having two kind of classifications of what we call people in industry. Sometimes we call these individuals a robber baron, and sometimes they were captains of industry. But basically, you could simultaneously be both a robber baron and a captain of industry. For example, Henry Ford is a captain of industry in the fact that he amasses a huge fortune because he utilizes those principles of scientific management to figure out how to make the car cheaper, and which allows then him to produce more and to be able to sell more on the open market. Does that make sense? And so that makes him a captain of industry. However, his sociological department and the rules that he applied or put in place on his workers makes him a robber baron. Does that make sense, guys? Yes, no, kind of, sort of, okay? So we see these individuals who are very domineering and very overpowering and kind of work the system in their advantage and often break the laws, but yet at the same time they are also very industrious individuals, okay? We can see this very clearly also a Standard Oil Company owned by John D. Rockefeller. Although he is able to undercut and buy out all the other smaller oil companies, he is not a very good boss for his workers. He's very, very harsh towards them, and also because he's able to amass such a fortune, it allows him basically to control many systems of government within the United States and have a lot of political sway over what was going on in the White House and in other buildings, which is why we see this map, or this here. You'll notice we have the Capitol building here, okay, we have the White House here, we have, this is, because that's the Capitol. That's the rotunda on, I can't remember, okay? And then these are other business and other industries. I know it's not the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court doesn't have a rotunda on the top. I'll think of it later, probably. It's not that big of a deal, but alright. Part of what is fueling all these industries and the growth of these industries, quite frankly, is immigration in the United States, okay? During this time period, we're going to see immigration grow quite dramatically, in part because of pushback factors out of Europe, but also in part also because of the fact that the United States has jobs available, and so it makes it very easy for immigrants to come to the United States in order to find those jobs, okay? So as we look at this period, we've already had previous periods where we've seen large numbers of immigrants, but what we're going to see through this time frame is we are going to see more and more people coming from what we call the new immigrant group. The old immigrant group, these were people that were from like Western Europe, so these are Englishmen, and they are Frenchmen, and maybe some Germans in there. They have a tendency to be Protestant. Does that make sense? So they are people that are, quite frankly, like other Americans. And although Jefferson said that the Germans would never be able to assimilate into English culture, they are the group that we're okay with, right? Okay. The new immigrant group has a tendency to be more from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. They have a tendency to be more Catholic than Protestant. They also have a tendency, in some cases, to be Jewish, okay, to not be from the Protestant denomination or even the Catholic denomination. The new immigrant group also has a tendency to be less skilled wage laborers, okay? They are not the best of the societies, but rather society's kind of poorest of the poor. Does that make sense? They would be kind of considered that other countries' throwaways. Where earlier immigration periods, we had seen more of the upper class people coming into the United States. Now that's not always true. This goes through ebbs and flows depending on what the push factors are. If you remember pre-Civil War, one of the big push factors was the potato famine, right? Well, those Irishmen coming in, they're not the best and brightest of Ireland, they're the poor of Ireland. Does that make sense? So we go through periods of this in our immigration history, and it's the same today. We go through, currently, the vast majority of people that are coming to the United States and immigrating to the United States are doing so, at least originally, to get a college education. Does that make sense? Okay, and in fact, the vast majority of immigrants who are currently here illegally actually entered into the United States legally. They just stayed past their time that their work permits were in effect. Does that make sense? So when we look at this, okay, here's just a map. Okay, you can see the number of immigrants coming based on the dots. Okay, this is 1881 to 1890. Apparently my animation didn't work, sorry. Okay, if we go forward, we're going to see dots getting larger from areas like Russia, Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, etc. Okay, most of these immigrants, if you look at it, the vast majority of these immigrants will go either to like New England in this region. They'll either go out to California or they'll come into the upper Midwest. Okay. So into areas like Wisconsin, Minneapolis, the Dakotas, okay? And so when we look at those individuals and we look at the map, right, it's foreign-born children as a percentage of the population, right? If we look at, for example, in Minneapolis and even right across the border in what would be Moorhead, you're looking at more than 75% of the population.
Is there any special reason
why they would come here at that particular time? The reason why they're coming here at the particular time is because of the availability of land. You can still homestead under that. The other thing that makes the numbers a little bit deceiving for us is it says a percentage of a population. So our populations are still pretty low in the Dakotas, and so since our populations are already low, the percentage of people coming here is going to appear higher. Does that make sense? So it's a little bit deceiving in that sense. But when we look at more into Wisconsin, into areas of Minneapolis, there's more industry in Minneapolis. There's industry in Wisconsin, industry even in like Michigan and Detroit, etc. Does that make sense? So the Dakotas is a little bit of a misnomer. Same with Wyoming. It's just because their population was still so low. So it kind of messes with the numbers a little bit, or appearance of the numbers, right? Okay? But if we look at, like, for example, a lot of people going into Connecticut and Rhode Island and New York, those are places that already have very large populations, right? And they still have a very large population of the immigrants that are going there. Again, because there's factory work that's available there for them, and it's relatively close by, okay? Remember though, the vast majority of immigrants that are coming to the Dakotas are either gonna be of Scandinavian descent or German descent. It's just a factor of the fact that those were the high populations that were already here, and immigrants had a tendency to cluster within immigrant groups that were similar to them. That's why if you go to New York City today, there's like Little Italy and Chinatown and things like that. Does that make sense? Okay, although some of those lines are blurring today, and it's interesting, you go there, and it's like Little Italy, quote unquote, but yet then there's like a Spanish bodega down the street or something like that, right? There's like, so the lines are not so rigid in today's society as they would have been before, during this time frame, okay? All right, we kind of already talked about this, right? The difference between Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, reasons for coming. Largely the reasons for people coming don't ever really change. People still come to the United States for the exact same reasons that they've always come to the United States. Better opportunities, escaping poverty, escaping persecution, trying to find something more. Does that make sense? So it's not anything new, or different reasons for that. But much like in earlier periods of time in which immigrants come to the United States, once again, the United States gets very fearful of immigrant groups coming into the United States. This again, remember, and just really, really remember this, this is not a new trend, right? Jefferson, before even the United States, talks about the Germans and about how they shouldn't be coming into our country, okay? We get pre-Civil War, and we have the rise of the American, what party? Do you remember? Yeah, the what? Say it, guys. No, not the Whig. No, nothing. Okay? They're close though. But the Whigs are in there too, right? And the Whig Party is developed pre-Civil War. And one of the things that the Whigs question is whether or not we have all these immigrants coming into our country. Okay? So you're not entirely wrong, but the Know Nothing Party is the very anti-immigrant party. Okay? And so we have these. We also will see in the 1920s then the development of the American Protective Association. They were opposed to the immigrant threat. Right? Now, if you can't pull synthesis from this topic, then I don't know. Because can you connect this with today, with the past, with whatever? You should be able to, right? Because again, this isn't that different, right? And they argued that the new immigrants are inferior stock, right? They are the bad of the bad coming in. If you were to quote President Donald Trump, they are sending all their rapists and murderers and blah, 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 right? Okay, so that's the same kind of argument that is coming in through here and through this time frame. They also argued that it was a plot by Europe to cause the downfall of the United States by sending us their mentally ill. They also did not like the Chinese laborers because the Chinese laborers never really planned on staying in the United States or Americanizing or becoming American citizens. Also that as much as anti-Semitism is strong in the United States and anti-immigrant is strong in the United States, there's also this thing called yellow peril, in which we had a very, very strong fear of the Asian community. And as a result of yellow peril, we will see restrictions, in particular on the Chinese workers, and we'll see as such then the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Thus, after the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, we completely barred the Chinese from moving into the United States and emigrating to the United States. And those that were already here were not allowed to become citizens whatsoever at all. Okay. In addition, we will develop both Angel Island and Ellis Island as a way for us to filter through the immigrants. The process at Angel Island was much, much more rigorous than the process at Ellis Island. At Angel Island, you could get stuck on the island for months on end before you were actually allowed into the United States. You had to also prove that you had work available for you, that you were coming to, in order to make it through Angel Island. And so it does become a much more difficult process in that aspect. On the other hand, Ellis Island, Depending on where you came from, it could take a few hours to a few days to process through Ellis Island, okay? Ellis Island is located off the harbor in New York City. Has anybody been there? No? Go to close up with me. Next year, will you, no, yeah, no, 2019, yeah, so you guys will be seniors. Okay, come close up with me. And then you'll get to go to New York, and we'll go to Ellis Island. It's pretty cool. We go see the Statue of Liberty.
I don't know when.
What? Close up.
What's that?
It's a trip that we take to Washington, D.C. and to New York. We will go in March of 2019. And cost of the program, it varies. I think it was about $2,700, but that pays for everything, your airfare, hotels, food, everything that you need. It's expensive, but it is a really good price if you were to do it out all on your own. It's actually pretty expensive, or pretty good price. We also will go to a Broadway show while we're there in New York, so it's a lot of fun. And I pretty much, once we got to New York, took my kids off of program for the most part, and we just ran around New York, and like, I'd take them out after curfew to like go into Times Square. Our hotel was right in the middle of Times Square too. It was really awesome. So it was pretty sweet. But anyways, so I thought it was fun. I don't know. Ask the people that went with me. There wasn't a ton of juniors, but Danny Pointer went with me. Paige Schomer went with me. I'm trying to think of my other juniors that went. Nick's a senior. Gabe is a senior. He went with me last year, so it was lots of fun. Anyways, okay, close up plug. Okay, but back to this. There are others. When we look at how people talk about immigrants, we can clearly see those observations. Ross wrote in 1914, "Observe the immigrants in their gatherings. You are struck by the fact that they are 10 to 20% are histitute, low-browed, big-faced persons, obviously of low mentality. They clearly belong in skins, waddled in huts at the close of the great ice age. These ox-like men are the descendants of those who always stay behind." We can see that also very clearly in propaganda that is coming out during this time frame. But when we look at whole, between 1880 and 1890, about 27 million Americans will come to the United States. 11 million of those 20 million actually return back home because of persecution and struggles here in the United States. By 1910, 1/3 of all Americans are either foreign born or at least one of their parents are foreign born. The vast majority of Americans will come through Ellis Island. The first person that goes through Ellis Island is in 1892. Her name is Annie Moore. She was 15 years old, and she came over with two brothers. And so we see kind of that process come through. When we were in New York, I was actually able to look up and find my great-grandparents and their papers as they came through Ellis Island. So that's also a pretty cool thing that you can do while you're there. So, and you can get like documents all printed off and everything else like that. It's kind of a treasure hunt. It's pretty cool. Okay? Because names weren't always written down correctly, so you have to figure things out by using birth dates and everything. But it was fun. Few of them had very little experience in democracy. Most were illiterate, and most will try to maintain their cultures. Jews were fleeing Russia because of the persecution of their beliefs, and the Italians were hoping that they would be able to set up schools, and also they believed in America there was always bread. So America was a place where they could go to have that opportunity. Industry needed these immigrants though too, because they needed the low-wage laborers, and they really kind of actively pursue some of these people as well. But as you can clearly see from this particular cartoon, most Americans look very poorly upon. Here it says on the gates, it says, "United States of America, admittance free, walk in, you're welcome, except for here's Uncle Sam standing at the gates, kind of plugging his nose at the guy. The guy is carrying both disease and poverty. It has superstition on a bone around his neck. On the barrel, which is an alcohol barrel that he's carrying on his back, it says Sabbath desecration, which is like the desecration of Sunday, of church, of religion. Does that make sense? He also has a bomb strapped to his back that says anarchy, okay? And I think this one says pestilence, but I can't remember for sure. I don't know if I can read it on here. I cannot read it on there, okay? But here are all these things that he's bringing with them and the reality of that, okay? These very much an immigrant threat for them. As a result of this and this ideology, we will see the passage of many pieces of legislation to restrict these immigrants coming in. We'll see both the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I've already mentioned. We'll also see passed in 1924 an act called the National Origins Act, which specifically set up a quota system in the United States, which only allowed people to come in based on the number of people who were already here in the United States. So it's going to allow more Germans and Englishmen into the United States and prevent more Jewish, Italians, Catholics from coming into the United States, these quote-unquote undesirables.
What was that one called?
The National Origins Act. But although there's a lot of pushback against immigrants, there's also those who support immigrants. Grover Cleveland said of immigrants, he said, "It is said that the quality of recent immigration is undesirable. The time is quite within recent memory when the same thing was said of immigrants who, with their descendants, are now numbered among our best citizens." This would include Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, as well as numerous presidents. Does that make sense? Okay? Whose families had at one point in time immigrated to the United States, and quite frankly, we're all pretty much immigrants here to the United States. Ralph Waldo Emerson says of the immigrant population, he says, "The German and Irish millions, like that of the Negro, have a great deal of guano in their destiny. They are ferried over the Atlantic and carted over America to ditch and drudge, to make corn cheap, and then to lie down prematurely to make a spot of green on the grass prairie." So in other words, their life's going to suck, and then they're going to die. Again, we can see this kind of idea of what makes an American citizen and who we want in our country through images like this. This one here by Kepler, this one is in your book of knowledge, okay? What is the basic idea of what Kepler is arguing here?
They're all immigrants.
Yeah, they're all immigrants, and it wasn't that long ago that they looked exactly like this guy. And they seem to forget that that is their past. Does that make sense? It is America that has allowed them to get to this point. So they should help this guy to get to that point as well. Okay, and that's the argument Kepler is making through here. Okay,
They're all fat.
what?
They are all fat.
They are all fat. Why? Except for a couple. Why would we depict people as being overweight?
Because they have a lot of money, you can buy a lot of food.
Yep, that's exactly why. It's a sign of wealth, okay? So anytime you see anybody that is pictured as being overweight, it is a direct sign of wealth. Does that make sense? Okay? Oh, good job. Okay? All right. Oh, apparently here's the wealth, the Emerson quote that I read to you guys. When it came to Asian immigrants, many Americans feared Asian immigrants more than any others, and many of them left for the exact same reasons. The Boxer Rebellion was going on during this time, poverty, famine, and there's also severe unemployment in Asia, and so they often came for and settled in Western cities. However, in 1868, we will start to see the first restrictions on Asian immigration with what's called the Burlingame Treaty. So it's Burlingame Treaty. Basically, it made it so that Asians could come into the United States unrestricted in order for railroad work. And really the reason for doing this is because William H. Seward wants to open up Chinese markets, and he feels like it'll create that kind of a deal. By 1870, approximately 9% of California's population is Chinese, but then in 1873, we go into a financial panic, and as a result, there becomes a great pushback against the Chinese workers. As a result, they faced severe discrimination and begin to be referred to as like coolies, or even Hindi coolie, Hindkuli, which basically means they're slaves, okay? Rough translation. The Chinese were also specifically targeted by groups led by an Irishman by the name of Dennis Kearney. He creates the Workmen's Party of California, and he would go around and encourage his men to cut off the tail of it's called the K, it's a hairstyle that was worn by the Chinese at that point in time, but he and his workers would basically go around and walk up behind a person and cut it off as a symbol of you're in America now, deal with it, like, you know, have this. And California also will pass laws called anti-K laws, which made it so that they couldn't actually wear by law their hair in that style. In addition to that, California will, specifically in San Francisco, will pass sidewalk ordinances that made it illegal basically for the Chinese to walk on the sidewalks. Their reasoning was that the Chinese would often carry like these, excuse my drawings, you guys know that I am like so totally the world's best artist ever, right? Okay, haha. Okay, they would carry these basket systems, which was common culturally for them in China, and it was an easy way for them to carry large amounts of product without having a wagon or anything else like that, right? Because it distributed the weight across the shoulders of the individual. But the problem the city said the problem was that it took up too much room on the sidewalk and then didn't leave enough room for other people to walk. So they said that the Chinese had to walk in the streets. But the other part of that is it helps to reaffirm racism. It helps to reaffirm ideas that the Chinese are no better than the mere animals that walk in the mud in the streets. Does that make sense? So it helps to reaffirm that. There's also a great fear that these individuals are taking away jobs from the Americans, which largely is untrue. But the Chinese Exclusion Act is ultimately passed in 1877, and it will last until 1913. So the Chinese will specifically barred from coming in and immigrating to the United States until 1913. The only reason it is overturned in 1913 is because the United States is seeking a greater ally in the Pacific as we expand outward through imperialism. Does that make sense? That's really the only reason why it goes away. But again, we can see that very clearly in images such as this one, okay, where here we are being welcoming to all these different immigrant groups. I'm not saying that this image is not in and of itself racist, okay? If you look at the caricature of the people from the different regions, it very much kind of makes them look as though they lack intelligence or are less civilized. But yet here we have Colombia, who's accepting all of these people in, except for the fact of the poor Chinaman. He is not allowed to be there. Okay, so she's pushing him out of the school. But everybody else is allowed to stay. I got ahead of myself, okay? A little bit, but so here is Ellis Island, built in 1892 as the United States' first immigration center. It closed in the late 1940s. Today it's a museum. You can go and visit. We already kind of talked about that. But the goal was to screen immigrants. They also actually had hospitals set up there, and they also had quarantine centers. So people who came to the United States with tuberculosis or something else could be quarantined and therefore not spread that tuberculosis to other people, because tuberculosis was something that once it spread, it caught like wildfire. So it allowed them to quarantine protecting them for a period of time until that passed as well. From Ellis Island, there's a secondary island that can be seen close by, and it is on that island that we will see where the Statue of Liberty is erected. The Statue of Liberty itself was actually a gift to the United States from France, okay? And when we got the Statue of Liberty, because we actually get the statue in 1873 when we're in a financial panic, the United States doesn't even have the money to build the pillar to put the Statue of Liberty on. So for a while, the Statue of Liberty just kind of sits there because we actually can't, like, set it up because we don't have the money for it. So in order to try to dry up and try to encourage financing and get people to donate money to build the base to set the Statue of Liberty on, they run a contest for a poem that will be used to inscribe on the bottom of the statue itself, okay? And a woman by the name of Emma Larassis actually wins that contest. Her poem is titled New Colossus. So her poem is in a reference to the Colossus of... Huh? You guys are mumbling, so I can't quite hear you. It's the Colossus of Rhodes. Okay? So look it up on your computer, you can see it, okay? But basically it's a reference to ancient Greece. Does that make sense? In the democracy of Greece, okay? So the Colossus was like, I mean, it's huge, but like it strode across 2 points, okay, at
Not
Rhodes.
wearing a lot either.
What's that?
It's not wearing a lot.
It's not wearing a lot, no, it's not, okay?
What's the Statue of Liberty made out of?
What is it made out of? It's actually made, it's a bronze statue, okay? But because it is a bronze and copper statue, it allows, it creates the patina, which makes it green. Does that make sense? And that's only the exterior of the statue itself. The interior of the statue is just framework, and you can actually go up into the Statue of Liberty, and you can go up to the crown. There is actually a spiral staircase as well that goes all the way up to the flame. However, most often that's pretty much closed off at this point in time, just because for safety reasons. It's not meant to have tons of people traveling up it all the time, but you can. However, I will mention, if you come with me to Washington, D.C., although we get to go to the Statue of Liberty, when we go to New York, you have to pay extra to go up, and we didn't know that, and so we got around the base, but didn't even actually get to like see her feet, because you have to pay, it's an extra $20 ticket to get up to where like her feet are.
What's on her book?
So her book, it says, it's July 4th, 1776. You can see the IV here. So it has our date of independence on it, and then the book, there's some different comments as to what the book is referencing, whether it's a Bible or it's our Constitution, but we have both of those kind of references there. But in her poem, she very specifically outlines what she thinks America's immigration policy should be when she says in here, with silent lips, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Whoa, that's the one thing that we read in here, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it was in your book of English.
Did they like build it in the United States? Or did
No, it was built in France, and then it was sent over in pieces, shipped over in pieces to us, and then
So when we
reassembled.
didn't build the base, where did we keep it?
Basically, it was stored on a few ships for a little bit before we could get it.
Oh, I thought maybe we just like
Sitting on the island. No, it was stored. So, but so that she is quite impressive. Even if you can't get up onto the base, you're just down below. She is very, very impressive. So.
She ever broke?
No, but they are doing constant repairs to her. Much like all the monuments in Washington, D.C., there are lots of like repairs that have to be done pretty much on a continual basis. The worst that ever happened was the Washington Monument was severely cracked. There was actually an earthquake in Washington DC that caused a crack in the Washington Monument that was actually big enough that you could stick your finger through. So the Washington Monument has had to have major repairs done to it as a result of that. Okay, and these are just some pictures of Ellis Island as what it would have looked like. If you were to come with me to Washington DC and New York, we actually will take a ferry into the harbor after going to the Statue of Liberty, then we come back to the island itself, and we actually dock right here and get off right here, just as though the immigrants would. It's pretty kind of cool. Okay. Maybe I just think it's really cool because I'm Johnson. That's the medical center there. Okay. Well, yeah, it's okay. It's okay. I'm weird. We'll stop there as far as that goes because we're pretty much where I would like you to be. If you would like more information about close-up, I have some information hanging up there that you can take it. Keep in mind the prices are not on there because prices cannot be determined until we know like our exact dates of travel and what airfare is going to cost. But roughly last year was about $2,700, so kind of keep that in mind as
All
we're
those people at the mall yesterday that had access to the movie theater, they were all wearing Timbs.